Hello, everybody. It's Wednesday, so DebateSensei is here for another discussion. I'm here with Tim CB from Visolutions.
What's up?
All right, I'm Jared Kabika Miller, debate coach, professor of communications. And so this week we're going to be talking about counterplans. And as the old guy, I was going to tell you a tale about this. And, I think it's good to start with the fact that, like, I'm always surprised at how verbal debate theory or debate history is. Like, nothing's written down. Like, you just hear stories. You know what I mean? And it's just amazing to me. And so now that we're like recording stuff like this is what I heard. Okay, and it's really hard to verify it, but that counterplans weren't always a thing. You know what I mean? Like upwards of 50, 60 years ago, that like they were kind of the new theoretical addition to debate. That up until that point, you were just supposed to sort of like do direct refutation, maybe a disadvantage, but like on the negative, you won if you did direct refutation well. And the affirmatives just got so good at it that like the negatives had to come up with something else, and they came up with a counterplan. And of course, it's always based on something, you know what I mean? But it strikes me about how like that's also seems to be the same story for like the addition of critiques to debate theory, with that same sort of story arc about like introducing a new sort of offensive strategy, and it struggled for acceptance, and eventually it kind of got it.
Yeah,
I don't know. Have you ever heard like? You ever hear that?
I heard the in-between story. So the lore of perhaps 20, 30 years ago was the advent of the permutation. So it was the case that like affirmative plans would win and win and win because, the neg basically only had, direct refutation, DA type of ground or procedural ground. And then counterplans came in, and topical counterplans, or actually I should say extra topical counterplans, started just demolishing, because no matter what the topic was, if you had some, we're going to increase water access for sub-Saharan Africa, and like the government team does nothing to solve for that, like, yeah, you have greater magnitude and timeline and probability for all of your impacts on a counterplane that has nothing to do with anything, but it's like, hey, we don't care that they increase, tax subsidies, like we solve for this huge thing. So I think that's what I heard, is like the permutation became the fact that the negative was just killing affirmative teams like 70% of rounds. And so the permutation was invented as a way for the affirmative team to also get one extra fiat to get to do the counterplan as well, so long as the two are not mutually exclusive. So that was the lore that I've heard through the debate legends.
No, I think so. I think that I heard something similar, that like the counterplan, the permutation, and the critique all went through the same sort of story arc. We're gonna fold in Matt to this conversation right now. Let him get caught up. Hey, Matt, how you doing, man?
Hello, everyone. I'm doing all right. Yes, sir.
All right. I know, like internet gets spotty from place to place now. Like they fix it here, and then it gets upset somewhere else. So we were talking about like the story that I heard when I was a competitor about counterplans, and about how like they were like an addition to the theory. Kind of critiques were, just maybe like 20 years ago, or and then maybe 20 years before that it was perms, and then like maybe even 20 years before that it was counterplans. I was talking about how debate history seems so verbal. Like nothing's written down. You only just hear it. Like nobody takes the time to like this is what I heard. You know what I mean? And look it up. And so, what was your first experience with counterplans, Matt? Do you remember
that? I think I'm experiencing some technical problems. So if you can't, but I mean, if you can hear me, my first experience with a counterplan, I mean, that's very early on, and like the permutation was something that has always been tricky to me. I mean, at least not tricky, but it's a thing where it feels like very abusive sometimes, where like or I mean, I don't mean to say it sounds abusive, but especially when I was brand new.
Sure.
How about, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
That's one of those things that flips you like, wait a second. No, that was mine. You can't take mine. Like that was my cool idea. But no, I get it. I think that it's really interesting how it's evolved. I mean, just similar to even all the theory that we've discussed here, how it's just evolved over time, but how permutations have evolved to be this just like, built-in response. So as I was first kind of understanding what perms were, of like, oh, just because they have a counterplan doesn't mean that you have to go plan versus counterplan. You can perm and do both. And at first I was like, yeah, but like we wouldn't want to because theirs was the opposite. And a coach told me, no, you always perm under every circumstance, no matter what, because it's a test of competition. Is like the phrase that that we teach our students to use is like perm because it's a test of competition and it forces the negative side to do a deeper justification of why the two are mutually exclusive. So in order to have a permutation, it has to be possible for both plans to exist at the same time. If the funding is exactly the same for the plan as for the counter plan, that's like one way to try and kick out and be mutually exclusive. Like, well, you can't use the same funding to do two things that have the same price tag, right? So
exactly.
Sometimes there are tools like that, but I think one of the most interesting wrinkles is the plan inclusive counter plan. And I feel like that's so hard to beat. Like there's so many teams that win so many rounds on plan inclusive counter plans, or picks as those are more commonly called, that there have become more theory arguments on why picks are bad for debate. And I think like that's like a whole nother just like debating about debate level that become fascinating to watch. But so picks, I think they're awesome. Jared, what do you think?
See, I've always had a problem with the name of it, right? Like, I guess people say what I refer to as picks as these plan plus.
It's plan minus. Like a pick is supposed to be plan minus.
Yeah.
I know. Like that's how I heard it too. But like the title doesn't make sense to me. Like it seems like it would be the other way. Like, but I get it. Okay, most people refer to picks that way. It just doesn't make that much sense to me. I think that there are some things that are not that critical to what you're advocating, and then there's things that are critical to what you're advocating. I think that the pick can be done really well, and I think can be done for really good reasons. I think that the picks, as people call them, are just like any other theoretical position. People run topicality poorly, and people run disadvantages poorly. You know what I mean? It's like people do it for the wrong reasons. Or just like I think that there's like really brilliant ways and reasons for doing it that would be like focusing in on a critical issue, and so picks can do that. But then there's like I don't know, like I also feel sympathy for somebody like I don't know what it's a really good plan. Here's my best. You know what I mean? Like I'm gonna run a pick, and you know what I mean. And I still respect that. You know what I mean? I still like when people are kind of like, dude, like this is all I got, man. You're like, good job. So here's a pick coming at you shamelessly. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think something, Jared, that you just said that is really important, and it touches on other arguments we've talked about in the previous weeks, but like really kind of there's a difference between kind of like overarching saying we basically do everything they do except this one little thing, without really spending time articulating how like that is different, or like the implications of how this one thing, it may seem, the other team will very likely say something like, well, that's just one little thing and it's not any different, and they're basically just saying it's our plan. Like you need to really spend a little bit of time when you're essentially going to argue that their plan is basically correct except for this thing, and like it may seem like you're saying it and simply just saying that as like a tagline, like ours is a little bit different. That's not going to be sufficient, and like that linkage of like how your difference makes some critical impact change, like. You really got to like focus on those things, because where I meant to say earlier, like when it feels abusive, when someone says, we're going to do a $2 million stimulus, and the next team goes, well, we're doing a $3 million stimulus. Like, it's kind of like it feels very like
$1, Bob.
Yeah,
that's a great example. That's a great example. Like, because that's what I think should be called a pick. Like,
Sure.
like do 3 million instead of 2 million. That's what I think makes most sense for a pick to be like. And then I consider picks to be illegitimate. But the way people treat picks as these sort of plan minus, counterplans, I'm like, I'm totally fine with that. Okay, let's do an example. Right? Death penalty. Abolish the death penalty, right? It's like it's a strong case. It's a really, really strong case, in my opinion. Right? It makes a whole hell of a lot of sense. And like, I don't know, one strategy that I toyed with was, all right, except for serial killers. You know what I mean? Like the DNA evidence is overwhelming. They tend to, admit to it once they're caught. And oftentimes they, it's like they're okay being executed because they know that what they did was wrong. And I'm like, all right, so if you are so sure about it, then let's take the most extreme case, and see if it still holds up. Because if it doesn't, then I think the exception proves my point. But death penalty is not inherently bad.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, and like that's kind of one of those things where you're arguing like that's different than almost than like the funding stuff we're talking about, or like a perm of just kind of adding.
No, your example of the 3 million or 3 trillion rather than 2 trillion, I think that's what the pick should be called, and I think those are inherently illegitimate.
So, okay, a question on that then. So linguistically, I agree with you. Okay, plan inclusive counterplan should be right, like the plan plus this extra thing. Like it sounds like it should be plan plus. And so when you say then illegitimate, you mean like it's just very easily permeable because plan plus is permeable?
Yeah, I think any competition that you think of is artificial. And so artificial competition is like, like we're taking your funding. It's like, well, the funding isn't really the central part. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that's not where this clash is happening. We can get the funding somewhere else, right? If we're going to talk that, like we're just going to talk about, we're going to fee out where the funding comes from, then I'll take it from this military project rather than that. You know what I mean? It's like that's not central to this thing. What central is killing somebody for murder justified in our system. That's what's central. It's like, and I get the ground of the most extreme example on the negative, and I think that's totally justified. And so I think that is fine. I totally think it's fine.
I think that works, but I think an important piece to some of what Matt was talking about, like on the theory side, I think the best picks are run along with a more theoretical position, like the spec arguments we've talked about in the past. So timeline or time frame is one that is, I think, very infrequently disputed. So people just say, oh, it's normal means, we're going to do it immediately. But there's really great arguments that some people will make for, okay, we should actually do this in 2 years. And the reason is that, whatever, like the funding is only going to overwhelm this system. Like I've heard for judicial overhauls where you're running a policy that is going to change the way the courts function. They say like, well, if you were to dump this massive new law and it's going to arrest all these new offenders, like, yes, we should get these bad people off the streets. However, the courts are currently so backlogged, there's no way to solve it. It's only going to create greater logjam, whatever. So therefore, pass this in this time frame. So you can have like a procedural argument if you want to around time frame, or you can do it on agents or whatever. And that then is paired along with a plan inclusive or a pick, as even linguistically, if it's a misnomer, that's paired with a pick because you say, okay, do the plan, but with this separate timeline. So that's where you get your mutual exclusivity. You get all the same advantages, but then you can run a disadvantage on why the time frame is bad right now, or run a procedural on it. So I think that those are more well thought out picks, and I think those are far more persuasive. And I almost feel like it's almost dirty because I rarely ever see those beaten. Like I rarely see someone actually win on here's this whole plan that's really great, except for obviously like, especially on large pieces of policy, I think as more and more resolutions become large, Senate bill focused, like large pieces of policy, there's going to be some really, garbage stuff in any given policy. So do the whole policy minus that one thing. So I feel like a pick is almost so, low hanging as, just a ground opportunity. it's almost impossible to beat sometimes. And that's where I feel like, I don't know if I like him as much.
It just seems like it's a hardcore concession that it's a good idea. I mean, like when you have like some global, when you agree with 99% of something, and it's like, well, you know, so the AF is right. I mean, like, like I don't know, it feels that way. Go ahead.
I think what you want to do is when you're thinking about permutations, like think about in the real world, what would a permutation be like? And like if you're proposing a bill and you get somebody to squabble over some like really stupid non-central thing, then you're winning. All right, because they don't have a problem with your policy. And I think that's what we got to sell in the round. It's kind of like, listen, if they're squabbling over that, then the permutation wins because I can do the plan as is, or I could do it their way. I don't care. I still think I'm winning. That's the permutation. It's like I will agree to either one of those because it doesn't affect the central thesis of my claim. I don't think people get to that level on the permutation enough. You know what I mean? It's like, think about why you do this. What is the logic behind this? It's that you have a thesis. Does your thesis still stand by the end of rebuttals? If somebody's offering something that doesn't clash one way or the other, why the hell are they winning? That's not their game. That's not why they're supposed to win. You know what I mean? It's like they're supposed to, like, I made it really clear. So as long as you're clear from beginning to end, you should still win because it makes the most sense, in my opinion.
I think I wanted to bring up also kind of in responding to permutations and PICs, like it's your job. Like, how do you create? How do you show there is no mutual exclusivity or like things like that? And I just was gonna say things like, you know, regarding spec arguments and like if someone's arguing about money and funding, these are areas ripe for like argument on both sides and showing things like if Jared kind of said how you could just pull money from if they're going to pull money from here, we could just set up some other allocation of funding from like a defense budget or something like that. Like those arguments, although they feel small, they can be ripe grounds for proving or disproving mutual exclusivity. And like, if nothing else, is what I'm saying is like, we don't have an unlimited source of money, despite like any belief, like, you know, the government has a lot of money and this and that. But like, it's our job to kind of talk about how like, you know, we can't just compile two plans or like, you know, like there is limits to like how much we're going to be allocating for this problem, no matter what the debate round is trying to, you know, whatever policy may.
Right. Yeah, I mean, but that you have to run the disadvantage, right? It's like that's why you're forcing the disadvantage. You have to say, all right, what is it about my, you know, $2 trillion that's bad and your $3 trillion that's perfect? You know what I mean? It's kind of like you have to, like, you're putting the burden on the negative. That's why I also believe that you can't win with a counterplan unless you have a disadvantage. You know what I mean?
I tend to agree.
It makes no sense to me that you wouldn't have, like, that is what competition is. I think that you should always run a disadvantage separate to the plan, to the counterplan, and you always have to run a counterplan in tandem.
Go ahead, Tim.
So maybe just a greater question. I think what we're getting at then is your maybe like judging philosophy on ground. So maybe you have a bigger understanding or a larger framework of what government team's ground is. So I think that a pick is a way, or really like most counterplans are ways, honestly, of kind of cutting into affirmative ground, right? Like, especially if you're doing the plan minus something in there, it's like negative teams get to play this like, oh, it's impossible for negative teams to win, so we have to come up with something, and therefore counterplans are our way to still play the game, whatever. I think it's great, especially when there's new stuff that comes up, but I think it becomes a question of ground. So do you feel that it's the case that a really great plan minus some stuff is still essentially affirmative ground because it's still the same thesis as the affirmative team?
Like I said, it kind of depends on what you're squabbling over. You have to like judge. It's kind of like, okay, if I lose this argument, does that mean that my thesis is now invalidated?
Yeah. Right? So like the big example is like Medicare, right? So when passing,
the funding pick is what we're talking about, right?
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, and that stuff seems a little bit fringe, but I'm talking maybe more about core tenets of a new policy. And it makes more sense when you're arguing large policies, but like Medicare, for example, was a common one that, the affirmative government team goes and passes universal health care or whatever, or some Medicare for all bill. And then the negative team comes in and says, okay, everything except Part D, because here's 15 reasons why Part D has been, the drug portion of Medicare has been done so poorly, is so abused by Medicare or by, pharmaceutical companies, is so, terrible to people with different needs. Like, it's a really crappy thing. So don't pass this overarching thing. Sure, it does some good stuff. Don't pass it with Part D. Otherwise, you are killing people with diabetes, or you're killing people with AIDS, or with these types of cancer, or whatever. And that sounds really persuasive to me, to where it's like, yeah, I get it. We're now both arguing for universal health care, but one side includes Medicare Part D and one side does not. I kind of err towards the side that does not. Like, it seems like a more nuanced theory, or a more nuanced, thesis. And I guess I kind of buy it. Like, it is biting into aft ground, at least, but maybe my view of the affirmative's potential ground is smaller then.
I mean, like, certain questions start popping to mind, right? It's like if we, what in like Part D. So if the government isn't funding Part D, how is that part getting paid for? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like that's the question I'm asking. On the
and there's good disadvantages against it, right? Because like then if the team has to fund, via some additional weirdo tactics, or they're like, oh, the free market will solve it, or whatever. Like, there are good disadvantages that I think affirmative teams don't spend enough time running against counterplans. So like there's good squabble there, but that's just an example of like a large policy, but one major segment of the policy may be shitty.
What I'm saying. That counterplan doesn't mean much to me unless I hear the disadvantage to Part D. Like that,
right.
Like it doesn't make sense to me. I'm like, okay, so now you have something that maybe it competes, but I don't know until I hear what's that disadvantage. What's so bad about Part D? Let me hear this. You know what I mean? Like, and that's the test. I'm like, did you just assume that everybody knows that Part D is bad, or?
That's what I meant to say, is that they'll have, here are 5 reasons why Part D is terrible, because it allows for pharmaceutical companies to run
DA2,
et cetera, blah, blah, blah. So when they have lots of argumentation against one specific segment of a greater policy, that seems persuasive to me, that they have a more nuanced understanding of the policy, and they're not just passing some 800-page bill that no one's read. They care about, like, that middle 200-page bit is actually a problem, when we shouldn't just pass legislation because it's got a catchy title. Like, I think that that's a pretty solid, interesting, place for an argument, but it does back the affirmative team into a corner. Like, either they're non-topical by like squirreling their way out of, the whole resolution, or like they've got to deal with part and parcel of a policy that probably has some bad stuff in it.
Yeah, I guess if I was on the app next time, I would just say, we're going to pass parts A through C. All.
My advice is to save that advice for the next round.
Yeah, in all honesty, it's a great strategy. Like, all right, get into this arms race, and I'm still winning Medicare for all. I think that would be my perm. It's like, imagine a different round in which I just passed A through C. Then they wouldn't have anything to say about it. It's like, so this is not central to the Medicare debate. What's central to the Medicare debate is whether or not healthcare is a human right. Yeah. And we agree.
I mean, just even to respond, I mean, I'm trying to think, it's all about creativity, right? And Tim's right. Like, you are backed into a corner. Okay. So like, and I'm not, but
I'm not saying it won't win. It might. Yeah.
But like, a good way to kind of one way to approach that is to kind of say like, look, it can take a long time for a bill to get as far as this bill is. You know what I mean? So like, are we really going to throw out everything good that they admitted that, A, B, C, E through Z all does, all because of this bad stuff that Section D does? Why wouldn't we just pass this plan and we could amend it later or something like that? You know, like you could get around it by like facing it. Like don't a perm in that situation, and especially where the neg brings in a bunch of specifics that they've obviously researched, and their nuanced understanding, like you said, is all, what I think one thing is just to focus, to answer that, focus on the good that they conceded the entire plan does, focus on the global impacts and weigh those against the specific nuances of these. And if you have any sort of ground there, time, like I was trying to kind of say, like, if you're going to throw out a plan that you're admitting is good, most of it is good except this one thing. It takes a long time and a lot of money to make this happen, for that build to be on the docket, you know what I mean, to be voted on.
The thing is that, like, everything Tim is saying is totally true. It's like it's the job of the negative to get it. Is like when you're talking about, are you cutting into the ground? It's like you're not. The job isn't to cut into the ground; it's to get them off their ground. They staked out the ground, and you get them off the ground. And that's what a pick does. Is like, if you throw this shiny object in front of the affirmative and they follow it, like look, I lured them off their ground. That's what it does. You know what I mean? And so what I'm saying is, if you're a smart affirmative, just go for it. Don't go for the shiny object, right? It's kind of like a funding pick, like Part D pick. It's like, don't let that frazzle you. It's kind of like, what's your thesis? Come back to the thesis. Make sure that you say that like 40 times throughout the debate, whatever your thesis is. And just say, I'm still here. I'm still standing where I said I'd be standing.
I got one more for you then. So it sounds to any debaters out there watching, you get Jared as your critic. You probably are not going to go for that pick, but I got one really good one for you. So this is a good old like Matt Voles one that he had us run a bunch of times because we like put a lot of theory into this. So we would run consultation counterplans, and we'd have a theory shell of Paulo Freire and pedagogy of the oppressed, and say that like when you just pass policy without discussing with the people that are impacted, that it creates all these like negative, awful things, and like there's all these like Orientalism impacts from Edward Said and stuff. So like we had this theory talking about why you have to discuss with people, and we would say it was binding consultation. So it was possible that after you consulted with the Iraqi people, like we're going to send troops, do the surge, send more troops into Iraq. If you consult with the Iraqi people and they say no, they don't want more troops, then you can't do it. And so that was the mutual exclusivity, because we said like if they were to perm this, they would not be topical, right? Like that would be effects topical. They would assume solvency only after something happens. Or actually it would be extra topical rather. They would assume a second step. So that was the way out of it. What about those? Like, is that an area where you feel like picks maybe have more ground?
I think it's a brilliant strategy. That's my first thing. Okay. It's like, do that shit. Like, I would love to see more of those debates, right? And if for no other reason than like, let's get to the next level. What would that next level be? If there was something that the people that you're consulting with, the result would be something that is contrary to the thesis of the plan, and that should be a deal breaker. The affirmative should stand firm that, like, I'm sorry, like, if, like, when we consult, at the end of that consultation, they say we're doing something completely different than what was proposed, I do not agree to the perm. So then you're right. I do think that it would be mutually exclusive. But also, there's no guarantee of solvency now.
Right.
Like,
and that's exactly like...
Right? Like, you just gave away solvency. Like, so that's like, don't go for the shiny object. It's kind of like, remember what the thesis was. Remember what we're trying to solve. I said that this plan solves. It doesn't, if they go with something else, I can't guarantee that solves. I'm not going to endorse something I can't guarantee. So I guess it's competitive, right?
I mean, that's why we found it competitive. Like, we would pose those arguments of like, hey, they come up and perm this, solvency goes out the window because we're literally leaving it up to someone other than their agent of action. Like, it cannot happen. The plan is not passing. It's only passing under the condition that something else. So, and that can actually apply to a lot of different things. Like, I think that's a common position that like we started teaching, like even, further negative teams, that even in novice rounds, like they got it and it was a good, solid, spot that I wish came up more. So I think consultation counterplans have like some good ground to maybe come back. I don't know, like Matt, are there other kind of counterplan directions or like creative directions you've seen people use perms or use, counterplans that have, made it work well?
I mean, the classic one that just sticks out in my head, like I said, is like a funding one where you propose some plan for $1 million, and they propose one for 2, and they tell you how the AF who proposed $1 million will never solve, and it's kind of like,
Right.
okay, all right, well then I guess we all agree on everything except for the dollar amount, and like, I don't know how abusive it is for the AF to kind of like, fine, $2 million. The bill says 1 right now, but like, but to kind of what you were just saying, like, I really like. It's so much of it is just about the AF's reaction. You know what I mean? Like if you I'm in debate, so much of it is just how you are perceived. I mean, if you look shocked and you look confused and you look scared and you start conceding that they were right about everything and that they're solving for the AF ground, so you're just taking all their stuff, and like that reaction shows almost, I mean, it just goes beyond the arguments themselves. Like at this point, you just look like someone who's not in control anymore, and to some degree, faking it till you make it, whatever you call it, like just seeming like you are in control of the round is partially, heavily weighted into your like who gets circled at the end of the thing. So don't be scared, when the AF is just when the neg is simply just like taking AF ground. I mean, so often it feels that way, in my mind, or pushing, they're trying to bully you into some very narrow, hyper focusing on one small aspect of the issue when so much of your plan solves. You really just need to like highlight like the global things that like they are not disagreeing with 80-90% of everything, and like don't let this, we're not going to be shaken by their they agree with us, and stand on it.
All right, man. Hey, that's our time right now. Okay, so I want to thank Matt Shapiro, JD.
Thank you
for joining. Tim Stevie from Visolutions. I'm Jared Kabika Miller. I'll see you all next week. All right.
Have a good one.
Thanks.